Welcome to this panel on value-added tax and UBI. We'll start with a presentation of Jette Weinel and Bernhard Neumärker on the implications of UBI on utility functions and tax revenues, some consequences for the relevance of a consumption tax-financed UBI, an investigation on the level curve of the consumption tax with an underlying UBI in a neoclassical model. Jette Weinel is research assistant at the Weinel Chair. Professor Neumärker is director of the Weinel Chair and head of FRIBIS. He is also member of the FRIBIS team Value Added Tax and UBI. We then will have a presentation of Florian Wakolbinger, economist from Linz, Austria, member of the FRIBIS VAT-UBI team as well. He will present a study elaborated by him and two other members of the VAT-UBI team, Professor Friedrich Schneider and Dr. Elizabeth Dreher, both also from Linz, who investigated how introduction, an unconditional basic income, and at the same time, shifting the tax system from income taxation to the taxation of consumption would impact tax revenue and consumer prices. After that, I will say a few words on value-added tax and why value-added tax and UBI matches. My name is Enno Schmidt, research assistant of the Weinel Chair and also member of the VAT-UBI team. After that, we will have some minutes for discussion. And now, Professor Neumärker, Jette Weinel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I just start the screen sharing. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Great. So, as Mr. Schmidt said, my name is Jette Weinel and I'm working at the Weinel Professorship in Freiburg. And Professor Neumärker and I will present today our current research project, the implications of the UBI on utility functions and tax revenues, some consequences for the relevance of a consumption tax-financed UBI. Our presentation is structured as followed. I will explain the motivation and the context of our work in the introduction. And this will then be followed by what we call a paradigm shift, which a UBI would induce. That aspect is particularly crucial since it indicates that we as economists need to rethink our understanding of utility, which we do in our approach. Intrinsic motivation and time sovereignty are, as I assume most of you know, two important arguments for a UBI and are therefore crucial in that context. Mr. Neumärker will then go on with the different government budget constraints and the consumption tax revenue. As you all know, the UBI implies a comprehensive change in the transfer and tax system. In Germany, for example, it would replace social transfers just like Hartz IV, child benefit, and housing allowance. In order to offer such a universal transfer to its citizens, any state needs to answer the question about how to finance those government spendings. And therefore, some UBI models argue that a tax reform is needed. The VATUBI group at FRIBIS, for example, focuses on a value-added tax-financed UBI. A consumption tax is, from an economic point of view, very interesting for several reasons. One reason is tax revenue. Here, we refer to the approach from Matthias Trabant and Harald Uhlig from 2011. As macroeconomists, they calibrated tax revenue curves for Europe and the US. And what they found is quite interesting. The consumption tax revenue curve does not peak. Instead, it is increasing. On the other hand, a UBI changes how individuals participate at the labor market. If one's socioeconomic subsistence minimum is covered through a regular and unconditional transfer, then she or he is free to decide how to spend his or her time. One is then time sovereign. We argue that this change in an individual's preference can be illustrated by a multiplicative utility function. Therefore, Travant and Uhlig's approach is crucial to us because of the model background they've applied. Hiaraga and Mutahara could confirm Travant and Uhlig's result in 2019 and showed that the consumption tax revenue curve is sensitive to the utility function. Travant and Uhlig refer to a multiplicative utility function which was invented by King and Revelot in 2000. Based on that, we have invented a multiplicative utility function which aims to represent the preferences of a UBI socialized individual. Professor Neumärker will then go on and discuss different UBI budget regimes that are possible. It remains an important question: what's the optimal UBI budget and how to finance it? With our approach, we aim to be able to model different tax designs for UBI, such as the social dividend, UBI earmarking, or mixed budget tax earmarking, which Professor Neumärker will talk more detailed about later. That leads me to the paradigm shift. So we argue that the change from additive separable to multiplicative preferences happens through a UBI and its effects on individuals. In mainstream economics, labor is defined as gainful employment. So an individual's utility is modeled as you can see it on the slide. One is willing to endure the suffering of labor in exchange for payment, which then enables one to be consumer sovereign. If that person now receives an unconditional transfer, which secures the socioeconomic subsistence minimum, it must have effects on the preference relation. The individual now starts to think differently of its own time. That emancipatory character of the UBI leads to a rethinking of the definition of labor. In an UBI society, labor can not only be gainful employment, but rather include all types of work, just as unpaid work, for example, a parent taking care of his or her child, and volunteering. It allows people an optional and fair participation through work and leisure activities. Those additive preferences, which are implicitly assumed and are the basis of our fiscal thinking and optimizing, are not applicable to a UBI receiving individual. What is induced by the paradigm shift from being socialized through a means-tested system towards a UBI is time sovereignty. And that is very important for our approach because it is the basis for why the basic income works. If an individual's socioeconomic participation is secured, he or she is free to decide how to spend his or her time. And what happens now, and that is exactly what has been shown in several pilots, is that people act differently. There is no force to work some random job anymore. People start to think differently about their time. They become time sovereign through the UBI. And yeah, that leads me to intrinsic motivation, because if one aims to model the preferences of an UBI receiving individual, intrinsic motivation is crucial. Yes, Frey says that persons are intrinsically motivated if work is performed for work's sake. In mainstream economics, intrinsic motivation is usually not considered. Traditionally, according to the principal-agent model, the agent is assumed to be willing to perform work solely by extrinsic incentives. This is based on the assumption that the agent himself cannot derive any positive benefits from working. The principal thus incurs monitoring costs to ensure that the agent performs his task properly. However, as jobs become more specialized, monitoring becomes increasingly impossible or very costly. And jobs with relatively low monitoring costs are very likely to disappear because of globalization and digitalization. That's why intrinsic motivation is becoming increasingly important in labor market economics. And also why a UBI will not result in a decreasing in the supply of labor. So to summarize the paradigm shift, time sovereignty and intrinsic motivation quickly, while we assume additive separable preferences implicitly in the means tested system, we notice that these preferences are not suitable for a UBI system because the UBI enables individuals to be time sovereign and intrinsically motivated. After explaining the logical background of our approach, we now come to the model. What you see on this slide is the model background. It's a very simple economic model of a closed economy. And I think that I do not want to get into it very much because Mr. Neumärker will get back to it in a few minutes. And just to give you a short overview, I will now into understanding of utility. As I explained, additive separable preferences are not suitable for a UBI society because of the time sovereignty and intrinsic motivation one gains through the UBI. And as I said in the introductions, our findings are inspired by Travante and Ulig and Tiaraga and Utahara's work, but they themselves refer to King and Rebelot's utility function, which you can see here. King and Rebelot invented that function in 2000, and they investigated extensive margin, which is employment or non-employment, and intensive margin, which is a greater or smaller number of per capita hours worked in a neoclassical labor market model. They found that the additive separable separable utility function is not suitable for representing both scenarios, and the difference in consumption between the unemployed and the employed. The multiplicative relationship, on the other hand, allows changes in work to be accompanied by changes in consumption. King and Rebelot therefore argue that the non-separability of multiplicative preferences is closer to the evidence and thus improves the validity of the model. Based on that function, we have modeled a UBI utility function. As you can see, the function inherits the multiplicative connection between labor and consumption, as well as the basic structure of King and Rebelot's function. But there are some important differences, which I will explain now. First of all, you may notice the term rho minus kappa, so work suffering subtracted from the intrinsic factor, which we have here. Obviously work suffering, moment, hang on, say, yeah. So, obviously, work suffering will always be part of life. There are always some aspects of a job that one does not like. But if one is time sovereign, he or she is free to choose something to do that they enjoy. Second, there's another new term here. So N, you can find here, is defined as labor in the conventional sense. But 1 minus N, which is here defined as productive free time, time that one spends volunteering or doing other unpaid work. It is important in that context to notice that productive and unpaid free time affects the GDP indirect. That's why we can consider it in an economic model like this. As you can see, we consider rho minus kappa for productive free time as well. This is even if it's one's free decision to be productive in his or her free time. And we could therefore argue that if they are productive, they must totally enjoy it. But we think that there's still a trade-off between those two aspects. Imagine someone mowing the lawn on a free day. He or she might enjoy doing that, but he or she could also spend that free time just relaxing. And it is that way with pretty much all activities we do. We can enjoy do them and be intrinsically motivated to do them, and on the same time wish we could just relax. So at that point in our studies, we do not allow kappa and rho, so work suffering and the intrinsic factor, to be negative because of mathematical and logical reasons. But we are right now thinking about the possibilities of rho minus kappa to be smaller 0 for gainful employment and greater 0 for productive free time. So you see this is still a work in progress, but we will give you an outlook on that research project at the end. And I think that because of the audience is quite heterogeneous, I do not want to get into the mathematics much more, but I'm happy to answer any questions at the end.
Okay, now it's my turn. Yeah. I hope that everyone can see this also. Yeah, so that was, I would say, the most important part, even if it sounds artificial and highly mathematical, but that's important for introducing UBI also to typical economic analysis, yeah, by adding to a neoclassical argument the behavioral argument of intrinsic motivation and of time sovereignty. That's the task of the new utility function. And this utility function is clearly endogenous. This means when we have a UBI budget, yeah, a budget in which UBI is integrated, then utility will switch from this additive utility function, which is a neoclassical function, I would say, of the classical capitalist regime, towards a UBI regime. Yeah, this means the socialization of individuals will hopefully switch. And that's the basic argument, because individuals will switch from classical consumer sovereignty towards time sovereignty, based also on intrinsic motivation. Now, the interesting fact of the basic model, which was developed also by Yaraga and Mutahara, is that we can now add a lot of different budget regimes, and we can control it, yeah, by numerical simulations, and then we can see what regime might be appropriate for financing UBI, but also of other public expenditures. So this means different tax and budgets regimes are possible, and when they are explained, what and how to choose. So, because I'm an ordoliberalist and contractarian, I said in the end it's constitutional choice. We are not, neither Jette nor me, the person who will say this or that is better. But if we see the consequences, then the individuals in the contractarian stage will decide from the bottom up. So therefore, we have to relax on budget regimes from the viewpoint of the social contract. But before we do that, we have to know how the options work. This means we have to look inside the post-constitutional level, the post-constitutional model. So this paper will contribute to the post-constitutional stage, which we will then use in a later investigation for preparing the constitutional, the social contract decision-making on UBI budget regimes. So the reason is that we usually do not believe in an impartial observer, for example, the scientist who can show the optimal solution. The citizens will decide on a solution, and that's it. And it may be fair, it may be efficient, we do not know. It depends on what the constitutional interests of the citizens are. But what is then the normative criterion, the target of optimal UBI budget? Is it a UBI budget maximum? So this means that the UBI level may be maximized, or do we cover a certain UBI amount? Yeah. Do we like to have a so-called social dividend, a share of S, which is the UBI, on Y, which is the GDP, for example, to be defined in the constitutional stage, or do we like more other UBI types? And for that, we need such an investigation, which we cannot do without moving into the formulas more clearly to see what these different things imply in a model. So here we have the model in which Jette introduced with the production function, the resource constraint, and the government budget constraint. You see here we assume in the government budget constraint with tau c that we have only a consumption tax rate. A flat tax, it's just like the VAT usually is, times consumption expenditures, and this gives the tax revenue, which could be used for the UBI, the Demogrant S, or perhaps for other expenditures, for example, for public infrastructure G. Yeah. Therefore, we might have an alternative resource constraint where we not only have private consumption, but also public consumption for public infrastructure. This means we may have an expanded budget constraint, and we may then add to the budget constraint also labor income tax. You see here with N, we have the time of the representative individual investigating into labor time. This means earning money. W is the wage rate, and tau n is then the flat tax rate on this kind of income. And therefore, the household constraint with labor income tax means that gross consumption, 1 times C plus TC times C, which is the consumption tax, can be covered by the net income minus, you see here, the tax rate times WN plus the UBI. So a very simple model, but we can work with this model a lot concerning specified budget regimes, of which of all of them we can simulate them, we can calibrate them by numerical examples, which Hiraga and Mutahara did. And that's very interesting for us. First, we can differentiate between a social budget, this means a budget only for UBI, or a mixed budget, which is then also for public infrastructure. The question is, should we start with a pure social welfare budget? Should we start with a non-welfare state option? Or should we start with a mixed budget? You know, in the end, we will have a mixed budget from real life, but we should investigate the differences between these three different budget constraints. For example, with the UBI budget expenditure budget, we have UBI equal to the expenditures on UBI equal to the tax revenue, capital T. With pure public infrastructure budget, we may have the public infrastructure budget only covered by tax revenue. Here you see S is equal to 0, UBI is 0. This is the no welfare state option. But attention, you see now our endogenous utility function has to work, because if we stay on a pure public infrastructure budget, then we have to move back to the simulation with additive separability in the utility function due to the no socialization effect concerning intrinsic motivation and concerning time sovereignty, which is guaranteed only by UBI implementation. This will be implemented clearly in the mixed budget, but if the budget constraint is the same, then it's clear that the effects of UBI may be smaller than under a pure UBI budget with the same budgetary level. So therefore, this will clearly indicate different expenditure constraints. This will also indicate, you will see it when we examine the so-called lever curve, the maximum revenue level condition. It will indicate different expenditure levels which are possible. And in the end, we are interested in the optimal expenditure mix. Should we concentrate on S or on G or on both? The first regime, when we move away from specific budget regimes, is then the so-called social dividend, SD. The social dividend here in that model is defined as a share of UBI on GDP, Y, for example, 20%. This might be constitutionally defined by the citizen right that it is allowed to extract by tax revenues 20% of the total production in the society. This is a very interesting model, the social dividend. Why? Because this kind of social dividend originally depends on GDP growth. It's clear. The more Y increases, yes, the more S can increase. In the model, it has its features for simplification. You can substitute S for Y, or as you wish, Y for S. It depends on that what you would like to investigate. But it is a clear problem, and that's an implication for sufficiency. For sufficiency, we would need some measure more. For example, Y max, just like the idea of environmental regulations towards the 2 degree target. Yes, what should be the relevant maximum of the GDP, or that we stick to a given level of GDP, and we said this should be distributed in some way, but we are not interested in maximizing GDP anymore. Here in that model, it's solved very simple because we have no different consumers. We have simply a representative individual in this simple starting model. It implies also that we could or should integrate a care economy measure into Y, to see what sufficiency then might mean. For example, that we have not only production of consumption goods, which is supported by G, but it might be also care, which may be supported by also an infrastructure good called care support or caregiving. That's what we still have to do. That's work in progress. So what we can do additionally is earmarking of tax bases. You see here, we give more and more structure to the model. We do not believe in very rough interpretations. What should we do with the value-added tax? Should it substitute that, or should it substitute that? Is it for financing that or that? Is it for financing only UBI or the whole budget? We try to make it clear what is its behavioral implications and what its budget implications really are, because the budget depends on the behavior of the individuals when they react by applying their utility function to different budget regimes. For any student in the second semester of a bachelor in economics, that's clear, but it is not really examined for UBI, and especially not in the UBI scenery. So for the consumption tax, we would argue tax revenue is organized only by the consumption tax. An alternative would be we finance UBI by earmarking the labor income tax. Here, we do not discuss capital income tax. That's what we can do later in a dynamic version of the model. Here we are still in the static version. So the question is for our simulation, what may change when we move from a labor income tax to a consumption tax for the level, for the degree we can finance UBI when we assume strict UBI earmarking on one tax base. We could also examine now a mixed budget. As I understood it, for example, Mr. Wakolbinger will examine a mixed budget. Then we could, for example, argue, okay, we may have both labor income tax and consumption tax, but we allow to use the consumption tax revenues only for financing UBI and the labor income tax revenues only for finance public infrastructure. Then we have earmarking in a mixed budget, or we could have a mixed budget, as I mentioned it, where we mix the left-hand side as well as the right-hand side, and we don't have any earmarking of tax revenues to the expenditures. Yeah, this is a well-known basic principle, a non-affectation principle, non-Affektationsprinzip in German tax law and in other tax laws also, which is the dominant tax argument and the tax regime all over the world. Not tax earmarking, but as Buchanan said, investigating earmarking, it might be useful because then it's easier for individuals, for the citizens to detect for what they pay. Yeah, how expensive is UBI in terms of consumption tax and consumption tax adjustments of the individuals, and also how expensive is public infrastructure when it will be financed by labor income tax and my adjustments of labor time due to income taxation. So we have this will imply different revenue maxima, that's very clear, and it will imply, you will see different shapes of the Laffer curve. If it is the total Laffer curve, this means the total tax maximum revenue curve, or the maximum revenue curve of the labor income tax lit, or the maximum Laffer curve of a value-added tax, VAT-Laffer curve. So concerning earmarking of taxes, you see we can differentiate further on. Yeah? As I mentioned, the mixed budget given expenditure level. For example, we can constitutionally determine a UBI level. Here it is as with the bar on it. You see it as bar. Then a public infrastructure. This means namely G is the residual out of the possible tax revenue, which is based on a mixed revenue seeking by taxing consumption and taxing labor. Yeah, and on the other hand, what we tried in the past usually is to constrain public infrastructure or other public expenditures. That's a classical expenditure constraint, and then the social welfare state may be a residual of the distribution of the tax revenues. Now, this implies that combining earmarking with given UBI level means the budget level is fixed, and we will have some certain household adjustments indicated by the new utility function. We may have different revenue maxima. PI, do not forget that PI enters Y. We may have now in such a regime a trade-off between UBI and PI levels, and it depends on, for example, if public infrastructure investment is invested in climate protection, then we may have a trade-off between UBI levels and public infrastructure climate protection levels. This is not easy, and this is what the UBI advocates also have to examine, that UBI is not the solely thing in the world, that you usually have trade-offs, especially and also in the utility functions. Yeah. So the utility function Jette proposed in that PI is not integrated. This will be also work in the future. We can integrate it easily, but to control the budget and the simulation is not so easy then. So this implies also different shapes of the different level curves. To see now how a level curve is functioning, I would like to show you step by step the level curve. We call the level curve a curve which shows a tax revenue effect. We may have here a tax base X. This might be income, and therefore you may have here D as marginal monetary value of income, and producing income in the labor market may have its costs, or it's a partial market of a consumption good, and S is the cost of the marginal cost of consumption, and D is the marginal benefits of consumption. And if you raise here a tax, then you can show very easily that in point G with a tax rate of GF, for example, a unit tax GF, then you may have a certain level curve, and then you realize by this monopolistic tax price the peak of the level curve. And then you see on the right-hand side, the level curve shows decreasing tax revenues, and on the left-hand side, it shows also decreasing tax revenues. And by the way, in our actual discussion in the German coalition bargaining on the new government, this is exactly the point of the German liberals. You will see it here, where we have the traditional level logic for transfers. You see now it's transferred towards the tax rate now, directly the tax rate from 0 up to 100%, and the maximum of transfers. The tax rate might be on consumption, or it might be on income. It doesn't matter. Here in that basic model, it's on income, yes, of a flat income tax, and UBI as the demonstrant are in a more or less neoclassical model, behind which is only additive severability. Ignore please the formulas. What is first interesting is, you see it here, why many call now the German liberal Democrats, they try to implement voodoo economics, because they think when a tax rate decreases, it will lead to tax revenue increases. Then you have to be on the right-hand side of the maximum tax revenue and maximum transfer generating tax rate, T max. If not, then you will be on the left-hand side, and decreasing taxes by decreasing tax rates, yes, may mean less tax revenues, and by that you cannot cover any running deficits or public expenditures or whatever you like. So the German liberal Democrats believe they are on the right-hand side, and the Social Democrats and the Greens believe that they are on the left-hand side of Tmax. And that's an empirical question we also would like to investigate. But this is again the traditional level logic of transfers. What is now of high interest is that in our model, yes, Hiraga and Mutahara simulated this, and we want to simulate this also with intrinsic motivation integrated in it. We can simulate, and by numerical examples, the level curve for a consumption tax and for the whole system with usual and empirically evident parameters, like in the utility function of Jette's examples with eta being a half and lambda being 0.1. Then without the UBI effects of intrinsic motivation in these models, we have no rho, therefore no full time sovereignty effects modeled, only the extrinsic motivation models, you see with additive separability, we have a peak of the whole tax system, of the total tax revenue, at a rate of 45, around about 45 or 46% of tax rates, yeah, of GDP, yeah. With our utility function, which is nearby the Trabant utility function, one can see that the total tax amount will not show the peak. It will increase and increase. And why? Because the value added tax strictly increases. There is no peak of the value added tax. In the left-hand side example, you can show that under certain circumstances of other parameters, also the value added tax may have a peak, but not on the right-hand side. So it's calibrated only for the mixed tax regime. You see it here with UBI expenditures only. It's only one example. It's not the mixed budget, it's the mixed tax regime with 2 taxes, yeah, also with 3 taxes, but the capital tax, you see it is very, very low. It's not very important, and therefore it's not for a mixed budget. Here, public infrastructure does not play a role. And up to now, we don't have tested in such a numerical calibration the earmarking. So we need numerical solutions for the many different budget regimes. I have a lot more than showed here in this presentation, yeah, which could serve for constitutional budget constraints when you ask individuals what kind of earmarking budget system would you like to determine in the constitution and the social contract, under which now a post-constitutional UBI and perhaps public infrastructure and perhaps public consumption goods regime would like to work. And then the individuals can unanimously decide on it, not the paternalistic advisor, which could be Jette and me. Now concerning...
Mr. Neumärker, just a point, it's a little bit over the time, if you can be a bit quick.
Okay, because I still have 5 minutes for 30 minutes. I started it also, and on my level, I have 5 minutes. What is the mistake? But I have only two. I have only 2 conclusions. It was 30 minutes.
It's 38 minutes. It's now. It started there.
So I'm surprised a little bit, yeah, because I have it here and it shows 5 minutes left.
No.
Okay, I will be short. So concerning our conclusion, we need evidence-based calculations. That's clear. Second, we have to integrate voluntarism and the care economy in the utility function also. We would like to integrate also tax evasion, which is possible. Fourth, we have to integrate heterogeneous households instead of a representative individual. This will be very much demanding. Concerning the choice of the UBI budget regime, we have to decide on certain governance regimes if we like more authoritarian, more democratic, more participatory regimes when we have heterogeneous individuals voting on the different regimes. And last but not least, we have to add quasi-dynamic constraints, just like non-strategic behavior of individuals by deciding on the rules and deciding inside the rules, no renegotiation of the rules, no conflict due to the rules, and in the end, that the rules are self-enforcing. Thank you very much. And from my time, I still have 4 minutes left.
Okay, now we started at 16:53 with Jette, Weinel and you, but doesn't matter. Very interesting. Thank you very much for that. And now, Florian Wakolbinger, the floor is yours. Please unmute. Florian, you are muted. You have to switch the microphone on.
Thank you for reminding me. And let me just share the screen. And if you see the screen here, let me press. Okay, just a minute. Okay, that should be nice. However, if you see maybe not the first slide, but on the following slides, you will see that they are in German. I somehow didn't get that the presentation is in English. So let me apologize. I hope I will manage to get everything clear. What I want to say, I will simply translate the slides and yeah, do my best to explain what I want to show you. I will present a study on an empirical study, so to say, with admittedly a lot of assumptions on the introduction of an unconditional basic income, a UBI, in Austria or Germany. So we compare Austria and Germany. Austria is our home country, the home country of the three authors which are mentioned on the slides. Elisabeth Dreher, my colleague Friedrich Schneider from Linz, and myself. As well as our neighboring country, Germany. So we did the same study more or less for Austria and Germany, and it is on an unconditional basic income financed by a consumption tax. Importantly, financed by a consumption tax. Let me briefly walk you through the presentation. I will first introduce our model. Then, as I said already, we rely actually a lot on assumptions because our work is not very advanced at this stage. We are trying, so to say, to prolong this project, but we are actually at a quite early stage still. For this project, we rely on assumptions on wages, for instance, that we didn't model, so to say, how wages react to the introduction of an unconditional basic income. We just assume, and more or less that's how on what those assumptions are based. So basically, we compare two different scenarios. Then I will present the results. The results on three things, more or less, on how much money you need to finance a UBI, how do prices react, and yeah, that's basically it. How much money you need, how do prices react, and what taxes, on what tax, so to say, what tax you need, what are the tax rates actually? What are the tax rates you need to finance an unconditional basic income, together with everything what the state does now. Basically, we do not cut the performances of the state. We do not cut some what the state does now in terms of education, for instance, in terms of infrastructure. Everything in our model world, so to say, everything moves on, and in addition to it, there is an unconditional basic income. After that fourth point, I will conclude, and at the end of the session, of course, you're invited to ask questions. First point, our model, respectively the model which we want to analyze. The model, the unconditional basic income, which we have which we base our calculations on, is is 1,000 euro per month for adults and 500 euro per month for persons below the age of 18, and it is unconditional, as the name suggests, unconditional basic income. So everyone who is residing in Austria or Germany, I have to say, is receiving this unconditional basic income. This means for Austria we need roughly 100 billion euro per year. 100 billion, and for Germany, the tenfold amount, since Germany is roughly tenfold as 10 times as big as Austria. So it's roughly it's a little bit less than 10 times the Austrian amount. It's 900 billion roughly. Okay, that's actually the basic income. Then yeah, the shifting the tax system is another important point in our study. Shifting the tax system, in the first step, you could say in the first step, we abolish all taxes. And then we introduce two taxes to finance everything what the state does, including issuing and basic and in unconditional basic income. There are only two taxes in our model: a consumption tax and an export tax, which is actually also a consumption tax. It's a tax for exporting goods to foreign countries. This is because if we wouldn't introduce this export tax, then there would actually be no taxation on exports, which is maybe a little bit exaggerated. If there's no taxation at all on exports. This is because in the status quo nowadays, export goods are taxed by, so in the prices of export goods, there is usually social insurance payments, and there's also income tax. And if income tax and social insurance payments are abolished, then nothing would be left anymore. The value-added tax is not, so to say, is not relevant for exports, at least for a large part of exports. So an export tax, so to say. And the rate is different than the ordinary, as to say, ordinary consumption tax for domestic consumption. Okay, then a very important point is the third one. I don't know whether you see, no, sorry. The third point on the slide, and I will translate it, and it is that the basic income is additively issued to every income anybody has. However, at the first stage, so at the stage of introducing the unconditional basic income, the income from labor, for instance, or pension income is cut by the amount, or by at most the amount of the basic income. So you could view it as that some part of your income gets unconditional, and the other one you have from labor or from pension payments is cut. Okay, but don't think it is a crazy idea. There's also a second step. Okay, but for the moment, for this first step, the labor income is cut, and this would result, if you would, if this would, so to say, come into effect, the result would be that labor income and pension income is cut by roughly, on average, 40%. Okay, so nobody gets less income, but a part of income is, so to say, unconditional. However, of course, this is when I heard this idea first, I think I thought it sounds crazy a little bit, and it's not. Of course, it's not. You cannot force somebody to work for less income or more income for less income. So actually, there are behavioral changes, and immediately after the introduction of the basic income, there is, of course, negotiations on the labor markets, and the wages are, maybe they stay shortened, maybe they increase, and maybe they increase even above the initial level, so to say. Okay, so it's unclear what happens to wages. This is what I said. We rely on assumptions here. We didn't model this explicitly. We just have some assumptions. This is the early stage of our project, which we hopefully will be able to prolong, so to say. Okay. On these scenarios, or on these assumptions, two scenarios which I have on the next slides. The first scenario is that labor income and pensions stay at the level they are at in the initial phase, so stay at the lower level. They are cut at most by the amount of the basic income, and then they stay at this level. This is the first scenario. This is, of course, advantageous in terms of financing the basic income. However, it is unclear. It's actually doubtful, very doubtful whether this is this level will stay, whether wages will stay at this level. And the second scenario is that wages and pensions get back to their initial level, so that people have actually their labor. If they don't change labor, they don't change the amount of labor they supply, then they have their initial income, so to say, and then they have the initial income as well as the unconditional basic income. And we assume that hourly wages don't change. We assume that there are constant production technology. We assume that at the goods markets, there's no change in demand. According to if income changes by introducing a basic income, we also assume that we have a constant import structure, so that the import structure, the imports and the import share in the different goods also doesn't change. We do this analysis for 50 product groups, but I will present only an overview of the results due to time constraints. Okay, that's so far. Those are our scenarios. I explained it already. It's a little the first scenario looks at first sight a little weird, but it's a benchmark scenario, and it's not really complete. It's not completely unlikely, so to say, that this scenario comes into effect. But I would expect a scenario in the proximity, so to say, of scenario 2 here, that will come into effect if our project is prolonged and we can do a differentiated modeling. Then what would be the scenario we qualify as to be the most likely? I think it should be somewhere in proximity of scenario 2. Okay. As I said already, the slides are in German. Unfortunately, I didn't get that this is an English presentation, but let me draw your attention to the red lines. And the red lines, it says, the red lines, especially the lower red line, here you see what is the current tax amount that Austria and Germany collect. The left column is Austria, the right column is Germany, and we have a total yearly tax amount, tax and due amount in Austria of 165 billion, and in Germany of 1,300, roughly 1,300 billion. And we need this tax amount. And in addition, of course, you have to finance the state would have to finance the unconditional basic income. So this amount here in this slide, you have as well at the bottom line, so to say, you have to additional tax due that is necessary to finance the unconditional basic income. You have here the amount that the unconditional basic income takes, so to say, per year, and then there's a minor. In the following lines, there are things you can subtract. Okay, you can subtract because you don't need any the state, so to say, for its own employees. He hasn't got to pay the security, the taxes that they then give back as an income tax anymore. And you also don't have to pay certain household transfers because the UBI replaces those household transfers. So in total, actually, if wages don't change, then let me draw your attention again to the bottom line. If wages don't change, then in Austria you have an additional tax due which you have to collect somehow by additional taxes of 50 billion, and in Germany of roughly 600 billion euros. So quite a substantial amount. And as I said, we in our model want to finance this by a consumption tax and an export tax. In the first scenario where wages are cut, then the necessary additional budget is not so high, because the state saves a little bit on wages of its own employees. So it is a little lower. The budget is a little lower, 28. So it's in Austria 28 billion, and if wages stay at the same level, which I personally I think this is more likely, then you have 50 billion, and in Germany 460 in the, so to say, advantageous scenario in terms of financing the thing. 460 and 600 billion. Okay, and in the red lines, you have the total amount that has to be financed by two, in our case, two taxes, a consumption tax and an export tax. And as I note here, it's again the German expression, the export tax is calibrated such that the prices, on average, the average price of an export good is not changed such that competitiveness on international markets is prevailed, so to say. If wages are higher, then prices, so to say, will be higher. Prices of the products are higher because the wages are included in the prices, and then the export tax can be only lower. So the export tax is calibrated such that to a fixed price level, and the consumption tax then yields the residual amount that is necessary to finance the unconditional basic income. So I have on this screen here, I have the export taxes or the export tax rates, the rates of the export taxes, which can be issued in scenario 1 with the cut wages. It's 46% and 40% in Germany, and in scenario 2, which would be other corner, so to say, where wages are at the initial level, it's only 27% that is possible, 27 or 26%. And in both scenarios, interestingly, the consumption tax is 122. The consumption tax that guarantees financing an unconditional basic income is 122%. So it's roughly 120%. Okay. Then interesting thing, which is actually was one of the main points which of our study, what happens to prices? What happens to prices under all those assumptions? I repeat, one of the most important assumptions that at the good market, the demand at the goods market doesn't change. So people buy the same as before, but with higher or lower prices, so they don't change the magnitudes. However, the tax rate changes, and the tax rates included in the prices changes. And interestingly, for the scenario 1 with the cut wages, the price level, there's not much effect on the price level. If you consult the first line, it's -5 in Austria and 3 in Germany. It's our calculation, our result of calculation. In scenario 2, however, sorry. In the right column is not the price change, but the growth of the disposable income. So this is just the table for Austria, -5 and 22% price changes. And for Germany, if I may show this slide as well, for Germany, we have 8% and 31%. So it's a tremendous price increase if you introduce an unconditional basic income and if wages stay at the same level. So this is maybe the bad news here from this analysis, that simply additively issuing an unconditional basic income will be connected to price increases, or presumably will be according to our analysis, will be connected to price increases. Okay, then let me conclude. I think time is almost up, but let me say a few words for conclusion. We have, or just to sum up what I've said, our study was on introducing an unconditional basic income with two scenarios. In one scenario, the wages are cut, and in other scenarios, the wages stay at the initial level. It's just a hope, so to say, that wages are cut and then stay at the cut level, at the lower level. The likelier assumption is that wages stay at the initial level. We finance it by a consumption tax and an export tax, and the amount needed to finance is such that the consumption tax has to be roughly 120%. If you finance it exclusively by a consumption tax and an export tax. Of course, if you do if you issue some additional taxes like energy taxes or financial transaction taxes or wealth taxes, then it might be a little lower, but I think it wouldn't be much lower, so to say. Open questions which we would be able to answer in part, at least if our project is prolonged. Is it feasible? Such a more or less radical shift in taxation? And for me, the most important question is what happens to wages? What really would happen to wages if an unconditional basic income is issued? Will they increase? Will they stay at the same level? Will they decrease, as you could hope, in terms of price level and financing? And what happens to prices? Okay, that's actually, we answered those questions with assumptions, so to say, or we answered those questions by assuming corner solutions, so to say, or corner scenarios, but we would be happy to answer or to work in the future on those questions. So far, thank you. Enno, you are already visible, so this means my time is, I interpret it as my time is up, and I thank you for the opportunity to give this talk.
Thank you, Florian. There is a question from Peter Brake, and I think this is the same for some more people, that they are asking for an English version of your slides.
Okay.
Okay, so now I will start and bring my considerations. What I will say about VAT is based on two people who have dealt with VAT and the UBI in combination since the 1980s. The one is Dr. Benedictus Hardop, who was an auditor and tax specialist. He was involved in the introduction of VAT in Germany in 1968. The other one is Götz Werner, who is the founder of the German drugstore chain DM and one of the most influential proponents of basic income in Germany. Through Hardop, Götz Werner recognized VAT as a forward-looking tax that can also finance an unconditional basic income as, quote, a negative consumption tax. Or as Mr. Hardop said, I quote, the value-added tax shows the UBI as a negative tax levy via the instrument of financial social transfers, and to this extent represents a further development of negative income taxation. The following are some comments on the VAT from me in comparison with income taxes and the UBI. I will limit myself to only a few basic considerations. I want to be simple and focus only some basic principles. So first, the value-added tax is at the end of the value creation chain. The The value-added tax goes with the value creation steps across the various processing companies in the country concerned as a calculation variable, but becomes finally due when the consumer buys. If the value chain does not reach its destination, if the work done is not rewarded by the consumer at the end, the state has not received value-added tax from the value added. The end consumer pays the tax amount in the price of the goods or services as a share for the tasks of the public sector. For the incomes of those who work on behalf of the public sector, thus making economic value creation possible. Work becomes value in economic terms when the final customer buys. In other words, if the waiter's tablet falls out of his hand and the cup of cappuccino crashes to the floor, the state does not receive a share of the value added that has already been created up to that point. With the value added tax, the state shares in the entrepreneurial risk. Value-added tax does not become the company's money, does not appear in the accounting of the company. It is not a revenue of the company. It is a share of the price paid by the consumer that is given to the state. Tax is sharing process. One portion of the jointly generated value becomes purchasing power of the public sector, while the other portion remains or goes in the private sector. When the tax is levied in the prices for consumers, this sharing process is more clear. Second, if the tax is levied on income, this theoretically also presupposes a completed value creation. The result of the work has been sold, the company has revenue, the employees have an income, the customer has paid monies in the company and will be divided. Taxes are cost for a business just like any other cost. The share from the money that the customers have paid for the products or services of the company is passed on to the state as taxes. What to notice? Taxes that our corporations pay, that employees pay from their income, or that self-employed people pay, are paid from the money that comes into the business through the prices that customers of the company pay. In other words, taxes are included in the prices. This has nothing to do with whether the taxes are calculated into the prices beforehand, whether they are passed on to the customers, as it is called. It is simply a fact the money with which companies and employees pay taxes is a share of the money that the consumers have spent for products or services of the company. Corporate taxes, resource taxes, income taxes go with the prices into the value-added chain across the different companies and are ultimately borne by the consumers in consumer prices. The fact is that taxes can also be paid by borrowing or increasing equity through the sale of company shares or through the sale of company assets is a specific and special situation that is not dealt with here. In the end, it's always the customer's money that they have spent on the company's products that can be used to pay for energy, primary products, fees, taxes, tools, wages, and everything else that constitutes the company's cost and profit. Consumers are all of us from birth to death. Our society is designed so that no one can provide for himself, so that we all are provided for by what others do for us, and we all work for others. This is what makes our society so productive. This makes clear the economy is a field of social togetherness and activity for one another. The economy is in this sense, or the economy in this sense includes not only paid work, but also all the unpaid work. And as consumers, we are part of the economy just as we are as producers. and we all bear the taxes with our consumer spendings. Third, paying taxes from something that already belongs to me, my own earned income, is psychologically a different process than paying a public sector share when I buy products for my personal or my family benefit. Although this money is spent as consumer, although this money I spend as consumer is also my money from my income, but I do not pay the tax as a provider of services, income tax, but as a beneficiary of services of others, value-added tax. But does not reduce my income, which I have not even spent yet. It does not reduce my decision-making potential. It does not burden my initiative. It does not burden entrepreneurial initiatives. It does not tax the one who performs the service. It places a tax where I take the services of others for myself. The old mentality of self-sufficiency has been preserved in the income tax, understood as yield tax. It obscures the view of what work is nowadays. Work is often seen under the wheel of money. The result of my work is my income. The yield of my work is what money I receive. This is what is emphasized by the yield tax, the income tax. It holds to that the reason for my work is a selfish one. But what is work today in a society where no one can be self-sufficient? Working is doing something for the good and benefit for others. Work is work for others. Check that with yourself. The income allows me to work, but it is not the real result and not the value of my work. The value is what others get out of it, those ones to whom the performance is dedicated. Fourth, we can distinguish between nominal income and real income. Nominal income is the amount I receive as income. Real income is the amount I spend from my income on real economic values, on what comes in for me to consume and use. That's my real income. It's about real values, not theoretical sums of money. You can't eat money. Income tax taxes my nominal income and thus reduces my potential purchasing power. What takes a share from real income in real economic activity? So if I give you 100 euros, they are not for you because you will pass them on. Only what you receive in real values when you pass on the money is for you. Only when you spend the money, you have something real from it. Money is not value, but a certificate of the right to receive value. Where the consumer pays, where he lives, where he consumes, that is where value creation is at its destination and endpoint. That's where the value-added tax is due. And that is why the economist George Wakolbinger called the VAT a tax you can't run away from. We have seen, when I spend money as a consumer, I bear the taxes that are passed on to the state by the company and the employees. We could as well raise all taxes and social security contributions clearly visible where it is already borne today in the prices of the good or services. This simplifies the taxation that makes a tax more visible, that promotes more democratic awareness. The administrative burden of taxes would be greatly reduced in companies and at the tax offices. A lot of time and money would be saved. Economically perverse tax saving decisions would largely disappear. Part of being a sovereign member of a democratic community is paying what you charge. This is also the case today, but what makes it more visible? When more and more of today's jobs are replaced by software and automation, if project work increases, in which I work sometimes with this company, sometimes with that company, in which I use my skills optimally for this project, then for that project, If interim periods become normal in which you earn nothing, in which you have to train or retrain yourself, earned income is no longer a sufficient and reliable basis for tax collection anyway. But what is? Because people always consume, whether they are employed or unemployed, old or young, and more than enough is produced, even if fewer people have to devote their life to it. Value-added tax is automatically adjusted to inflation, not limited to taxable gainful employment, but is a fair tax and the global division of labor, but is related to the target point of real value creation and real income. Only where the money is spent, it gets social use and effect. What someone has in his private pocket is not yet interesting. In some respect, value-added tax pulls in the same direction as the universal unconditional basic income does. The UBI allows more personal initiative and self-determination. It's an initiative-enhancing framework, just like VATUBI. UBI takes the money yield away from work, which what also contributes to in some way. When I pay a price, I am paying for the income of others. If the price includes a share as value-added tax for the unconditional basic income, then I do nothing different than I do today. I pay income. The UBI will, to a large extent, replace today's basic income level in existing earned incomes and social transfer incomes. On average and across all industries, I will not necessarily pay more than today for goods or services. The main difference is that the basic income will no longer be included in prices as a share for the conditional basic income of others, but will be financed through value-added tax as the unconditional basic income. Value-added tax is the appropriate financing instrument for UBI in a democratic society. Those who take more services of others pay more, also more basic income for others, but not because they are wealthy, but because they claim more of society's value creation for themselves. So these are some comments from me. And I think now we have a little time for questions. And one question in the beginning was, it's always said that automation will reduce jobs, we lose jobs, but that is since 100 years. In the industrialization, people said the same thing. And the question is, will that really happen? And I would like to forward this question to Professor Neumärker.
Okay, will it really happen is a very different question, a difficult question. My argument based on our presentation is that it depends on the effects, on the total budget of other tasks, which you call services, for example, not only UBI, but services. And if, for example, the earmarking to UBI is appropriate to finance a UBI level which is high enough, Florian Wakolbinger reported that this could or should be possible, or if we should do the earmarking of other taxes to the other services, or if we need the value-added tax to finance every service and the total welfare state. Our model suggests that the adjustment effects will be totally different. It's difficult to calculate them. So therefore, for me, it's an open question. The argumentation looks just like a UBI to earmark to value-added tax due to a specific normative aspect of the equivalence principle mentioned by the famous Knut Wicksell, yeah, and also to our first impression that there is no peak of a value-added tax, that you can increase the tax rate, you can increase it if it is 30% or if it is 130%. It depends on what the individuals like as the UBI level, where the asymptotic constraint of the value-added tax revenue is what we do not know at the moment. Yeah, and that's the big problem. Yeah, where this asymptotic value is when we don't have a peak in the UBI society.
There's a second question from Peter Bray about will value-added tax increase to 120%? So is the relation 20% to 44? I think, Florian, that's a question to you.
I didn't quite get the question. Was it the question that whether
the value-added tax will rise so highly to a 120%?
Yeah. Yes. Yes. It will rise highly. It will rise to 122%. Now it's 20%, but you have to bear in mind that now in the goods prices we have a lot of other taxes that are included in the prices. For instance, the income tax or the social security contributions that the people who are producing the goods pay are also included in the prices, as well as many other different other taxes. So and if they are all abolished, if those taxes are all abolished and we have only one tax, two taxes, an export tax and a value-added tax, a consumer tax, a consumption tax, then necessarily, so to say, the tax rate is high. But the goods prices it depends a little bit on the wages and how wages react to the shift in the social system, introducing an unconditional basic income. The prices themselves of the goods will not react too far. I mean, you need for financing an unconditional basic income, you need more money than you need in the status quo nowadays. But it's not that. It's not impossible, so to say. I would say maybe the best answer, it's not impossible, and prices will increase, but the high rate of 122%, it's only because it's basically the only tax that finances the state.
Thank you, Florian. So we have no more questions from the audience, but Professor Schneider is here. Fritz, do you want to comment or ask a question too?
Given
Unmute, yeah.
the opportunity to make some remarks. The first remark is, unfortunately, as we have so far no finance, we could only report old results. We would be happy to have new results, and then we could go much further and have more interesting results, especially for Germany, yeah, where our paper is the only one who tackles this relation to finance it via value-added tax. Yeah, so maybe if this arrives sometimes, I don't know when, then we can show up really interesting and new results. We are working on this, but this takes time. And I still think, I still think our approach is one of possible, but it's a financeable one for Germany and for Austria. For Austria, we can show it's a financeable one. Whether it works if one of these two countries goes ahead and makes it as a first run is a more difficult question. Yeah. Also, one should really remember that the price increases 120%, because this was a question, is really a lot. Yeah, but the actual price increase will, of course, be much lower because we abolish all taxes on income. Yeah, so it's not as so we will have a dramatic increase in prices, or we will have a dramatic inflation. Yeah, that depends what actually then the reaction of the individuals is, and this will be the case. That will be also investigated in other papers when we get some finance to run experiments. That's all I have a moment to say. And my last remark, I would be really delighted if, as we are now posted in Linz from FRIBIS, we could get the papers other people write. So far, we didn't get anything. Yeah. So if we could get the papers so that we see what research is going on, and then we could react, that also would be nice.
Okay, that we are excited to hear more, to see more. Just to correct that, the 120% value-added tax is not necessarily an increasing price, but how Florian said, it is on reduced net prices from production because of the change that the current taxes, and maybe also because of the value, because of the UBI, wages and other things will be lower. But that's a topic for ongoing discussions. And so we are at the end of the panel. I thank you very much for joining us, for the very interesting contributions, and I wish you a good evening. Now in 9 minutes, we have the final session, and I see Mr. Neumärker, you again there. And for all the others of you, thank you very much, and good night and goodbye.
Good night.
Thank you very much
Good
for
night.
perfect moderation. Good night. See you.